Guys, I'm Haley. I'm excited to make this video. Finally sort of going out of my comfort zone to do something like this. Addie makes it look really easy and let me tell you that it is not that easy. So I want to talk about modified yoga poses during pregnancy. My disclaimer is that I'm not a yoga instructor. I have not done formal yoga training. Been practicing yoga consistently since I found out I was pregnant. And so I've learned a ton from yoga instructors that I've had, from research that I've done on my own, as well as sort of implementing a lot of the concepts of postural restoration, which is the type of PT I practice, into my yoga practice. I have a lot of patients in the clinic who love to do yoga, and a lot of times they get told that it's not something that they should do. I don't like to say that to anybody. There's always ways that we can modify something that you love into something that's going to be awesome for your body. Well, this is Betty. Hopefully she just goes away. So what I want to go over first, just with pregnancy, is that there are a few things that we want to be careful of. Obviously, you don't want to be laying directly on your stomach. You can early on in your pregnancy, and I did a little bit early on in my pregnancy, but obviously as you get bigger, it's not going to feel good. So things like locust and taking your cobra all the way to the ground, we want to avoid. The next thing is, for prenatal yoga, things to avoid is overstretching. And I think that's where yoga gets a lot of its sort of bad rap, is that we think that we're taking the body too far beyond its normal capacity. And so that's not true. If we're doing things correctly, we're being aware of our breath and our position. So just continuing to be aware of not over lengthening those hamstrings. We have a lot of hormones right now that are making things a lot more flexy and bendable than they maybe would be other times. One of the other things is inversions. Around the 10 to 13 week mark, when the placenta is really starting to anchor itself down, we probably want to avoid really aggressive sort of headstands and upside down positions. But for the most part, if you were doing those beforehand, then you're probably going to be just fine. Obviously, consult with your doctor, talk to your doctor about any new exercise program when you're pregnant. Okay, so we're gonna go over some little sort of tweaks of all the different poses, and one of the major concepts that we want to tweak is the pelvic tilt, or lengthening through the spine. And so if Betty lets me, I'm going to turn to my side so you can sort of see. I'm going to use my bolster. And so as you get more and more pregnant, and your belly gets bigger and bigger, it can be frustrating to do a pelvic tilt. Mostly because gravity is just pulling belly and back more and more forward. And so a pelvic tilt really has two halves. It has a top half and a bottom half. And so if we're only thinking about the bottom half and trying to tuck that tailbone under, it can be frustrating because you can't get there. We want to also think about that top half, because that's going to bring us into a more comfortable tucked position. So it's not just our pelvic tilt, but also our ribcage tilt. And that's going to give us this nice lined up body. Addie talks a lot about this in the workout video, so you'll be well versed in that. Now we've gotten some of that sort of technical stuff out of the way, your body feels good, you're ready to start doing some yoga. What are we going to do that's a little different than in your regular practice? So my suggestions are that, especially in prenatal yoga, but I think I'm going to start to do even when I'm not doing prenatal yoga, is that we want to use stuff to help. So I just got my bolster, which I'm obsessed with. So we've got a big yoga bolster. You could use a big towel or a couple rolled up mats or something like that. Even a couple of foam, if you had a couple foam rollers, to help. Anything that can help support your body is going to be awesome. And a couple of blocks, maybe even more blocks. The more blocks that you can have, especially in prenatal yoga, is going to be awesome and feel amazing. It's just nice to support your body in its movements as much as we can. One of the things that I love to do with my bolster, which I've already showed you in that first video, is just sitting on the bolster. It just feels comfortable to get into that nice pelvic tilt. A lot of times when practices will start in a lotus position, and that's okay too, as long as that's feeling comfortable and we can feel that nice long spine with that rib cage back and that pelvis tucked under. But I would definitely say putting something underneath your tailbones is going to feel awesome, whether it's the bolster or a block or 2 blocks. I feel like I'm getting wider and wider. I need 2 blocks to sit on versus just 1, which is why I got a second block. We're going to start in this nice position. And so in yoga, there's a lot of different breathing techniques that come into play. For the most part, it's nasal breathing, which I love. It forces your tongue up into your palate. It helps support your abdominal wall. And so starting that practice, just focusing on nice breaths in and out through your nose, imagining that you're filling up that lung, and then really more importantly than imagining that filling is that we want to feel that full exhalation. So really getting all of that air out with that exhalation, pausing for a few seconds in that exhalation before you breathe in. And really in that pause is when we're going to get that nice internal oblique and transversus abdominis activation. It's going to help support you. Okay, so most practices will start in some form of sitting. Oftentimes we'll start in child's pose, so that's going to be where we'll start. So in child's pose, we want to start to make room for belly. If you don't have to yet, that's fine. You can have your knees together. But I tend to like to start going into my child's pose in the all-4 position. I like that because it reminds me to get my rib cage lifted, my tailbone tucked under, and then I rock back into my child's pose. I bring my knees a little wider to make room for baby. And if it feels good, you can stretch out long. But what I've been doing that's a little bit more comfortable lately is I bring my elbows to my knees, tuck that pelvis under, press through those elbows to feel more expansion into that upper back. A lot of times breathing can become more difficult as you become more pregnant because baby comes up under this rib cage. I've had a lot of success with good long exhalations keeping baby out of my rib cage and finding other places to get air. So if we're not maximizing that back expansion, we're going to feel like we can't get enough air in. When really, if we can expand that rib cage in other directions, we're going to feel like we can get plenty of air in. So that's my child's pose modification. Next, let's come into, from that child's pose, we're going to keep that nice tuck. We're going to keep rounded. Take a nice breath in. Exhale. Keep that tuck as you come up into your table pose. And so we want to try to find that low back is nice and flat, that rib cage is lifted to the ceiling, and we can feel these outer ab muscles engaged. And then my tweak for yoga, prenatal yoga, is that versus, instead of doing an exhale here and an inhale as we come down into cow, I want to use the inhale and expand that back rib cage up into that cat. And then as you exhale, coming into neutral. And so lumbar extension and that pelvis forward position, we already know through the day that back is getting pulled into that position. And so we don't need to reinforce it anymore. So I'm using that exhale so I can feel those abs engage, come towards a neutral or just slightly extended spine before coming back up and reversing that extension into cat, cow, cat, cow. And really don't particularly like the name cow pose right now. So I go cat, neutral spine, cat, neutral spine. Okay, or slightly arched. And it does feel good to move that spine through its full range of motion, and there's nothing wrong with doing that as long as we're controlling it with the breath and it feels good. Okay, so those are those first two. So getting into the next sort of series of exercises, we're going to start in the all four position. So we'll start in the table. And in this position, there's a lot of really nice things you can do for your body. Particularly circulation in wrists and hands and ankles, especially here in North Carolina in this hot summer. There's just, the circulation is not the same. It's humid and it's hot. So we want to take care of those wrist joints and those toe joints and those ankles. So starting in this table pose, we're going to have a nice flat spine, feel those abs engaged, and you can just do some rocks forward, clockwise, counterclockwise, keeping aware of that nice pelvic position. Different angles of your hands, so turning fingers out to the sides, turning fingers back towards your body, all will feel really good to help with that swelling and just that tightness in the wrists. So that's a nice way to start. Okay, so then from this table position, there's some stabilization work that we can do. So we can come in from here, trying to lengthen a leg. And so the key here is that we don't want to let that low back fall into extension, but we want to think exhaling. You can come long with the leg. And if it feels like you can handle it, then we can come out with an arm. Good, and holding for a few breaths. Fairly challenging stabilization pose, and then we can come onto the other side. Okay. So then from this all four position, it's natural to come into that downward dog. I do want to go over something that's nice for those ankles, is toe breaker pose. So you tuck those toes under, and you can kind of tuck into, all fours and rock back. There's nothing worse than a foot or toe cramp in the middle of the night. So being able to keep those toes free feels good. Especially going into this next pose, which is going to be our downward dog. I have decreased a little bit of my downward dog in practice just because of some reflux that I've had down there, but if you're not staying down there too long and having really good exhalations, it feels good. How we're going to modify this down dog is that we're not going to float your sit bones to the ceiling. We're going to keep that tailbone tucked under to really try to keep this rib cage and pelvis lined up. So it's going to start with a good breath in, and then you're going to exhale. Feel those ribs come down, and if you're not ready on that first exhale, then don't worry about it. Exhale, ribs down, and then coming up. So our tailbone stays tucked under. A lot of times we get told to float those sit bones to the ceiling, but when we take those sit bones to the ceiling, we're taking that hamstring and putting it on a lot of stretch. So we're going to keep that pelvis tucked under so we can feel those abdominals still engaged. come up. And if you need to, walking those feet towards your hands, trying to press those heels to the ground. Good. You can pedal out your calves there. You need a little bit more of a stretch in those calves. Good. Okay, now we've done down dog, table, and some work on all fours. We want to start to flow now from downward dog into planks, maybe some chaturanga push-ups. We'll talk a little bit about cobra and cobra modification, and then maybe flowing into some runner's lunges. So from our downward dog position, we can transition into a plank, or you walk your feet out, keep that back flat, come into that full planking position. And if that's not feeling good, and you can't keep those abs engaged and you feel that back engaged, coming to here is fine. And then from here, typically we'd flow down into a push-up and then into a cobra pose. And instead of lowering all the way down to the floor, I've been doing rounds of 4 or 5 push-ups there. So you can keep your pelvic tilt, ribs are lifted to the ceiling, and doing instead of lowering all the way to the floor. And then you can lower down, and if it feels okay on your abdominal wall, you can go into a gentle back bend. Good. Okay. So the back bend is a controversial yoga pose in prenatal practice because we already know that rectus abdominis gets really over lengthened. And so if you're feeling a lot of tension across your belly and it doesn't feel good, then I would just keep that out of the practice. And what you can do instead is coming from your push-up back into your tuck, lifting the knees, and coming back into your downward dog. And that's perfect. I would say earlier on when belly was just starting to stretch, I totally stayed away from those. But now things are feeling a little looser, a little bit more flexible. I'll throw in maybe 1 or 2 throughout my practice. Okay, so let's try that runner's lunge again. So we're gonna tuck under, round back, exhale, up, lifting that leg, keeping those abs engaged as you come through, taking that foot nice and wide for belly, and then bringing both blocks to your sides so that you can feel like you're supported. I'm going to bring them up to the top level. So we've got that back leg straight, knee is up to the hip, ribs are pulled back, abs are engaged. And then if we come up into standing from here, it's important to keep that pelvic tilt. And then one of the biggest takeaways I've taken away from prenatal yoga is pelvis is tucked under. Just let that back knee bend. Helps you keep a nice neutral level pelvis. Thinking about not allowing hip to stay real open. Whoops. We want to keep that left or back pelvis level with the front pelvis. Thinking about keeping those inner thighs engaged. Then we can come back down to our blocks, hands down on the floor. Good. Okay, so next we're going to talk about after our runner's lunge, we're going to talk about arms coming up overhead, some forward folds, warrior variations, and our sort of mountain and tree, some balance poses. So we're going to start down in our downward dog. Then we'll come up into our runner's lunge. Uh-oh, where are my blocks? Oopsie. So we'll come into our runner's lunge. And then from here, we can come up right. And if arms want to come up overhead, that's fine. But we're thinking about those ribs being down and that back being nice and straight. Good. So then from here, we can transition into turning that back foot, keeping nice and wide, coming into our warrior. And so the keys here is that we don't want to let that low back be arched. We want to try to keep that pelvis tucked and the rib cage drawn under just as much as we can. So I'm going to switch legs. So back leg is turned open, keeping that knee in front of the toe, keeping this rib cage down. And we can come back into our runner's lunge, hands coming back down to our blocks. And then from here you can step that back leg up. We're going to still keep using our blocks. And then we'll come into our forward fold. And so forward fold may need feet coming wider, and that's fine. But I have definitely been taking full advantage of blocks, not stressing out, and even taking a soft bend in the knee. Good. Half lift, coming up off the blocks. Good. Okay. Then coming up into standing, we want to think about rolling up, feeling every vertebrae as you come back up into standing. And then we'll talk about mountain pose. And so mountain pose, everyone feels like it's just sort of a passive pose, but it's really can be quite active. And so what we don't want is we don't want to hang on the backs of our knees, our low back. This is a very easy sort of position, especially as belly's getting bigger, to hang out in. We want to think about rooting through our heel and our big toe, feeling that pelvis under, and feeling the rib cage come back. Anchoring those feet through the ground, anchoring arms down, feeling long. Okay, so now we're going to go into a tree pose. And so you can pick which side you want to start with. We'll start on the right leg. And what you want to think about on that right leg is as you come onto that right leg, you want to almost think that you're hiking up your left hip into the hip socket. That's going to give your right glute max a little bit more work, and this left abdominal wall. Then from here, whatever feels best, you can have ankle on your heel on your ankle. You can go calf. You don't want to land on the knee, or you can come right up to foot on the inside of the thigh. You don't want to let that hip sink out. You could stand here all day long with that hip out. We want to think about keeping that hip in line with your body and keeping that right hip hiked up so that right glute is very, very active. And then you can do any variation of your arms that feel good. So we'll come up. Woo! And that's okay. To be respectful of your balance and your changing center of gravity. So we'll come back in here. Let's come to my calf, feeling that right left hip is hiked. Right glute should be burning. Good. Then we'll come back down and relax. So we're going to do the last part of Savasana, just getting into that nice, deep, meditative, relaxing state. one of the things that tends to become really uncomfortable is just laying flat on your back because of that sort of arching that starts to develop. And so I'm going to go over two really basic poses that right now that are good really throughout all of pregnancy, as long as they're comfortable. And that's really the key, is finding positions of comfort. Laying flat on your back, I know, or laying on your back at all sometimes is frowned upon, but as long as you're not having symptoms of that your blood pressure is really changing, or you're getting a lot of numbness and tingling in your lower body, should all be fine, especially in first and third trimester, just being aware of it a little bit more in your second trimester. So we're going to take, this one's called Stonehenge. We've got your 2 blocks and your bolster across. You could even do this on the edge of a chair. And it's just going to be that we take legs and rest them up on here. And then letting that head relax. I tend to put hands on rib cage or hands on belly, just to soften that rib cage and find contact with that lower back on the floor. Or hands out to the side and just trying to sink. Good. And then we'll move out of here. And then we'll come into the recliner, which is one of my personal favorites, especially if heartburn has been an issue. So we'll go here and here, make a little stand. Oh, Betty's gonna join me. And then coming back into the bolster, whoopsie, letting head fall back, feeling that tailbone tuck under, and letting this chest open up a little bit. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that sort of yoga modification video, and hopefully I'll get a little bit better at making these videos as I practice a little bit more.